The night was heavy with the hum of crickets, the air thick with summer heat that clung to the small, sleepy town. On a dimly lit street, the faint glow of a flickering streetlight cast shadows that danced eerily across cracked sidewalks. The silence was broken only by the occasional distant bark of a dog. A man in his late 30s strolled calmly, his gait unhurried, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his jacket. His name was Marcus. To the casual observer, he seemed like just another passerby, someone you'd see and forget within moments. But Marcus was anything but ordinary. Unknown to most, Marcus had spent years perfecting skills few could fathom. His past was cloaked in secrecy, his experiences shaped by countless encounters with danger that left no room for hesitation. Despite his calm exterior, he carried an air of intensity, a quiet storm that hinted at untold stories. Tonight, however, he wasn't looking for trouble. He had come to this town for peace, seeking an escape from the chaos that had defined his life for far too long. But trouble has a way of finding those it shouldn't. It started with the sound of footsteps, deliberate, synchronized, and closing in. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know he was being followed. His instincts, honed through years of survival, told him everything he needed to know. There were multiple people, their strides heavy with arrogance, their intent clear in the way they moved. "Hey, you!" A voice barked from behind, laced with a mix of disdain and malice. Marcus paused, his back still turned, his expression unchanging. He took a deep breath, his muscles relaxing rather than tensing, a response that would seem counterintuitive to most. Slowly, he turned to face them. Standing before him were four men, their faces hardened with a mix of anger and misguided superiority. They were members of a local gang notorious for their brazen behavior and deep-seated hatred for anyone who didn't look like them. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, smirking as if he'd already won whatever fight he thought was about to happen. "You're in the wrong neighborhood," the leader sneered, his voice dripping with menace. Marcus said nothing, his eyes scanning the group with a calm precision that unsettled them more than they cared to admit. "What cat got your tongue?" Another member jeered, stepping closer. Marcus tilted his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing exactly how a situation would unfold before it even began. "Let's teach him a lesson," the leader growled, motioning for his crew to close in. The gang moved as one, their confidence bolstered by their numbers. But as they stepped forward, they'd failed to notice the subtle shift in Marcus's stance. What happened next would remain etched in their memories forever. Without raising his voice, Marcus spoke for the first time, his tone steady and deliberate. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." And just like that, the night took a turn they could never have predicted. The silence in the air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as the gang's leader squared his shoulders and narrowed his eyes at Marcus. There was an unspoken challenge in his posture, a defiance fueled by years of unchecked arrogance. The others mirrored his confidence, their smug expressions barely concealing their anticipation of what they thought would be an easy win. But Marcus, still standing calm and composed, didn't flinch. His eyes darted from one man to the next, measuring their movements, their weight shifts, their breathing. He had seen their kind before, too often, in fact. Men who thrived on fear, who built their reputations by preying on the vulnerable. It was always the same. They mistook numbers for power. They mistook loud threats for control. And worst of all, they mistook silence for weakness. The leader sneered, breaking the tension. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he's some kind of tough guy." The others laughed, the sound echoing down the empty street. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward, waving a metal pipe like a trophy. "You're not walking out of here the same way you came in," he said, his grin wide and menacing. Marcus sighed softly, the sound almost imperceptible. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting them have their moment of misguided victory. He wasn't here to prove anything, and he certainly wasn't looking for trouble. But as he glanced past the gang, his eyes caught a glimpse of something, or someone watching from a nearby window. It was a young boy, no older than 10, his small face pressed against the glass. His wide eyes were filled with fear, his hands clutching the curtains as if they were the only thing keeping him safe. Marcus knew that look. He had seen it before, in places far from this small town. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, who had learned far too early that the world could be a cruel and unforgiving place. In that moment, Marcus made his decision. He couldn't walk away, not with those eyes watching. The leader barked a laugh, mistaking Marcus's silence for hesitation. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue." Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Last chance. Walk away." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. The gang froze for a moment, their confidence wavering just enough to be noticeable. But the leader quickly recovered, shaking his head with a mocking laugh. "You're really not from around here, are you?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he took a single step forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The leader's smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. Marcus had seen it, hesitation. It was the crack in the armor he had been waiting for. The wiry man with the pipe lunged first, swinging it in a wide arc aimed at Marcus's head. But Marcus didn't move the way they expected. He didn't duck or step back. Instead, he moved forward, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion. His hand shot out, catching the pipe mid-swing, his grip like iron. The man's eyes widened in shock. But before he could react, Marcus twisted the pipe out of his hand with a precision that spoke of years of training. The others hesitated, their bravado quickly unraveling. Marcus let the pipe fall to the ground with a loud clatter, his gaze never leaving the leader. "You don't want this," he said quietly, his tone almost pitying. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. With a growl, he motioned for the others to attack. They rushed forward as one, their movements uncoordinated but fueled by sheer determination. What happened next was a blur. Marcus moved with a grace that seemed almost impossible, his actions a seamless combination of offense and defense. He didn't fight with anger or aggression. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary strikes. Every action was calculated, efficient. It wasn't a brawl, it was a masterclass in control. Within moments, the gang lay sprawled on the ground, groaning and clutching various parts of their bodies. None of them was seriously hurt. Marcus had made sure of that. But they were defeated, their confidence shattered. The leader, still on his feet but visibly shaken, stared at Marcus with a mix of fear and disbelief. Who are you?" he stammered. Marcus didn't answer. He turned away, his steps calm and measured as he walked back down the street. He didn't look at the boy in the window, though he hoped the child had seen enough to understand that monsters could be defeated. As Marcus disappeared into the night, the gang's leader felt his knees, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he had come face to face with someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who had turned the tables with ease. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this man, whoever he was, had chosen mercy. But why? Back in his modest motel room, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts heavy. He hadn't wanted to engage, but sometimes the choice wasn't yours to make. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small, weathered photograph. It was of a woman and a child, their smiles radiant and full of life. Marcus traced the edges of the photo with his thumb, a deep sadness flickering in his eyes. They were the reason he had left his old life behind, the reason he had walked away from the darkness that had consumed so many years of his life. But no matter how far he ran, it seemed the shadows always found him. As he set the photo down, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Asterisk, we know where you are." Asterisk. Marcus stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He had spent years covering his tracks, erasing every trace of his past. But someone had found him, and if they knew he was here, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. For Marcus, peace was a fleeting dream. And tonight had been a reminder that his past was never as far behind him as he hoped. The question wasn't whether trouble would come, it was when. And this time Marcus wasn't sure if he could keep the storm at bay. The night was heavy with silence as Marcus sat in the dimly lit motel room, his mind racing. The message on his phone glared back at him, the words digging into his thoughts like a persistent itch. For years, he had worked hard to stay invisible, leaving behind the chaos and bloodshed that had once defined his existence. But no matter how carefully he planned, the past always seemed to catch up. He didn't know who had sent the message. But one thing was clear. It wasn't a coincidence. As Marcus weighed his next move, a memory surfaced, unbidden but vivid. He was back in a training facility years ago, his body bruised and his muscles screaming from endless drills. His instructor's voice echoed in his ears. Asterisk, control your environment, or it will control you. Asterisk. Those words had become a mantra, a guiding principle that had kept him alive through situations most people wouldn't have survived. Now, as he stared at the glowing screen, he knew he had to take control again. Marcus stood and began packing his belongings with methodical precision. He didn't own much. A few changes of clothes, a small first aid kit, and a set of tools that looked ordinary but could be deadly in the right hands. He didn't need much. Travel light, stay mobile. That was the rule. The streets outside were quiet as he slipped into the night, his movements fluid and untraceable. He didn't know who was watching, but he knew they were out there. His instincts told him they wouldn't strike yet. Not tonight. They were testing him, probing for weaknesses. It was a game he understood all too well. As he walked, Marcus' mind drifted to the gang he had encountered earlier. He doubted they were connected to the message. They were small time, driven by ego rather than strategy. But their presence in this quiet town was a sign of deeper issues. Something about the way they carried themselves, their unchecked confidence, suggested they had protection. Someone higher up shielding them from consequences. Marcus found himself heading toward the heart of the town, where the local diner stayed open late. It was the kind of place that attracted night owls, truck drivers, and people who had nowhere else to be. He slipped into a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room as he sat down. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, approached with a pot of coffee. "Late night?" she asked, pouring him a cup without waiting for an answer. Marcus nodded, offering a faint smile. Something like that. She lingered for a moment, as if sensing he wasn't the type to make small talk. "If you're looking for quiet, this isn't the place. Things have been tense around here lately." Marcus raised an eyebrow, silently encouraging her to elaborate. She glanced around, lowering her voice. "That gang, you've probably seen them. They've been causing trouble for weeks. The sheriff does what he can, but his hands are tied. Everyone knows they're connected to someone big, but no one says it out loud. People are scared." Marcus sipped his coffee, letting her words sink in. He wasn't surprised, but the confirmation added a new layer to the situation. Whoever was protecting the gang had influence, and that kind of power didn't come without strings attached. As the waitress walked away, Marcus's thoughts turned inward. He had spent years dismantling networks like this, criminal organizations that thrived on fear and manipulation. He hadn't planned on getting involved here, but the pieces were falling into place too neatly to ignore. The door to the diner opened, and Marcus's attention sharpened. A man in his late 20s walked in, his posture stiff, and his eyes darting nervously. He wasn't part of the gang, but he carried the weight of someone in over his head. Marcus watched as the man sat at the counter, fidgeting with a napkin while stealing glances at the other patrons. Marcus debated whether to approach, but the decision was made for him when the man's phone buzzed loudly. He answered it, his voice low but strained. "I told you, I don't have it yet. Just give me more time." The conversation was brief, ending with the man muttering a curse under his breath. He looked around the diner again, his expression a mix of fear and desperation. Marcus waited until the man left before slipping out behind him, careful to stay unnoticed. The man walked quickly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he turned down a dimly lit alley. Marcus followed at a distance, his footsteps silent on the pavement. The man stopped near a dumpster, pulling out his phone to make another call. Marcus watched from the shadows, his mind working through the possibilities. This man was involved, but how? Was he a victim, a pawn, or something else entirely? Before Marcus could decide his next move, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears. He turned his head slightly, catching the outline of two figures approaching from the far end of the alley. They moved with purpose, their silhouettes suggesting they were armed. Marcus stepped back into the deeper shadows, his breathing steady as he watched the scene unfold. The man by the dumpster didn't notice the figures until they were nearly on top of him. His eyes widened, and he stammered, "I am working on it. I swear." One of the figures grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "Time's up," the second figure said, his voice cold and detached. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, where a small, defective tool rested. He didn't know this man's story, but he wasn't about to let someone die in front of him. Not tonight. As he prepared to intervene, a voice echoed in his mind. Asterisk, control your environment, or it will control you. Asterisk. He stepped forward, ready to take control. The alley seemed to narrow as Marcus stepped forward, his movements purposeful but silent. The two assailants, focused on their prey, didn't notice him yet. The man they had cornered was trembling, his voice quaking as he tried to negotiate. "I'll get the money. Just a few more days, please. I'm good for it." The man holding him sneered, his grip tightening. "You've been saying that for weeks. You think we're here to chat. No more games." The second figure reached into his jacket, pulling out a blade that glinted faintly under the weak light of the alley. "This isn't a warning," he said, his tone sharp and final. Marcus moved in a blur, stepping into the dim light just as the blade-wielding man advanced. His hand shot out, catching the attacker's wrist with a precision grip, twisting it upward. The knife clattered to the ground, and the man let out a startled cry, doubling over from a quick strike to his ribs. The second assailant released the man they cornered and spun to face Marcus, his expression twisting into a mix of confusion and anger. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, lunging forward with a clumsy punch. Marcus sidestepped easily, his movements fluid and controlled. He didn't strike back immediately, instead letting the man tire himself out with wild swings. When the opportunity presented itself, Marcus delivered a calculated blow to the man's knee, sending him crumpling to the ground with a yelp. The alley fell silent except for the labored breathing of the two attackers. Marcus turned his attention to the man they had been threatening. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man nodded shakily, his back pressed against the wall as he stared at Marcus, like he was some kind of apparition. Who are you?" Marcus ignored the question, his focus shifting back to the two men on the ground. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Neither man answered, but the defiant glint in their eyes told Marcus they wouldn't talk easily. He crouched down, his presence radiating quiet menace. "You can tell me now, or I can find out the hard way. Your choice." One of them finally broke under the weight of Marcus's gaze. "We were just told to collect." "That's it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Collect for who?" The man hesitated, glancing at his partner before muttering, "Davenport." The name sent a ripple through Marcus's thoughts. It wasn't unfamiliar. Davenport was a name that carried weight in certain circles. He was a shadowy figure known for orchestrating criminal networks, the kind of person who operated behind layers of intermediaries and kept his hands clean. The man they had been threatening slid down the wall, his head in his hands. "Davenport," he murmured, as if the name confirmed his worst fears. Marcus stood, his mind racing. This wasn't just a local gang running wild. This was a piece of something much larger. He turned back to the man who had been targeted. "What's your connection to Davenport?" The man looked up, his face pale. "I owe him. I borrowed money, thinking I could pay it back quick. But the interest..." He broke off, shaking his head. I didn't know it would spiral like this. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was caught in a web far beyond his control. He didn't pity the man. Hate made his choices, but Marcus knew better than most how easily desperation could lead people down dangerous paths. The sound of a car engine roaring to life nearby snapped Marcus out of his thoughts. He turned toward the alley's entrance just in time to see a sleek black sedan speeding away. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had been watching. Marcus's jaw tightened. Whoever was behind this wasn't just pulling strings, they were monitoring the situation in real time. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a subtle reminder that no matter how skilled he was still playing in someone else's game. The man on the ground grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do." "They'll kill me." Marcus pulled his arm free, his expression unreadable. "Get out of town," he said, his tone curt. "Disappear. It's your only chance." The man nodded frantically, stumbling to his feet and bolting down the alley without looking back. Marcus watched him go, knowing the advice was likely futile. People like that rarely had the resources or resolve to truly vanish. He turned his attention back to the two men still on the ground. "You go back to Devonport," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate. "You tell him I'm here, and you tell him I'm not going anywhere." The men exchanged nervous glances before scrambling to their feet and retreating, limping as they disappeared into the shadows. Marcus stood alone in the alley, the weight of the situation settling over him. Devonport was more than just a name. He was a signal that this quiet town was caught in the grip of something dangerous. Marcus had no illusions about what was coming. The stakes were rising, and the game was about to get much deadlier. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. If Devonport wanted a fight, he just declared war on the wrong man. The night pressed on, thick and suffocating, as Marcus left the alley and blended into the deserted streets. His mind churned, piecing together fragments of information. Devonport's name was a warning in itself, but Marcus knew that if the man had eyes on him already, this wasn't going to be a simple game of cat and mouse. He needed to move quickly, yet his instincts told him the situation was layered, more intricate than it appeared. Devonport wasn't the type to send low-level thugs without purpose. As he walked, Marcus's steps grew quieter, his senses sharpening. A subtle itch at the back of his neck made him pause. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes tracing the darkened windows and quiet corners of the street. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. He slipped into the shadow of a nearby building, blending into its contours like a ghost, and waited. Minutes passed. Then the faintest crunch of gravel reached his ears. Whoever was tailing him was good, careful, deliberate, patient. But they'd made a mistake. Marcus tracked the sound to a figure leaning against a lamppost up the street, casually scrolling on a phone, their posture too relaxed to be genuine. Marcus circled wide, staying low and out of sight, closing the distance. He caught glimpses of the figure's face under the dim light. A young man, mid-20s, with sharp features and a confident air. Not one of the thugs from earlier, but not an amateur either. His body language screamed operative. As Marcus approached from behind, he made a split-second decision. Instead of incapacitating the man, he revealed himself with a single word: lost. The young man froze, his head snapping around. He tried to play it cool, slipping his phone into his pocket and raising his hands in mock surrender. "Oh, easy there," he said, his tone light. "Just out for a walk." Marcus wasn't buying it. "Walk somewhere else," he said, his voice steady but edged with authority. The man smirked. "Look, I don't want trouble. But if we're being honest, you're the one who's been causing waves tonight." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're with Devonport." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not with anyone. Let's just say I've got a professional interest in what's happening here." Marcus stepped closer, his presence imposing. "That's not an answer." Before the man could respond, a car engine roared to life behind them, its headlights flaring to life. Marcus turned just in time to see the sleek black sedan from earlier barreling toward them. He grabbed the young man by the collar and dragged him out of the car's path, both of them hitting the ground as the vehicle sped past, narrowly missing them. The young man scrambled to his feet, dusting himself off. "All right, maybe I underestimated how messy this was going to get," he muttered. Marcus ignored him, his focus on the sedan as it screeched to a halt at the end of the street. The doors flew open, and 4 men stepped out, their silhouettes imposing against the glow of the headlights. "You want to explain who they are?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. The young man hesitated, then sighed. "Let's just say Davenport isn't the only one with an eye on you tonight." Before Marcus could press further, the men advanced, their movements coordinated. They weren't amateurs, and they weren't local muscle. Their precision suggested training, the kind that came with a government badge or a hefty paycheck from someone like Davenport. "Get down," Marcus said, pushing the young man behind a parked car as the first shot rang out, shattering the air. The street erupted into chaos. Marcus moved like liquid, his body a weapon honed by years of experience. He darted between cover, disarming one attacker with a calculated strike before using the man's own weapon to disable another. The young man watched in stunned silence, crouched behind the car as Marcus dismantled the group with a lethal efficiency that bordered on supernatural. When the dust settled, Marcus stood amidst the wreckage, his breathing steady as if nothing had happened. The young man emerged cautiously, his hands raised. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky but laced with awe. "I'll admit it. I've never seen anything like that." Marcus ignored the comment, stepping over the unconscious bodies to pick up a discarded radio. He turned it on, cycling through channels until a voice crackled to life. "Status report. Target secured." Marcus brought the radio to his lips. "Not exactly," he said, his tone cold. The pause on the other end was telling. "Who is this?" "Your worst mistake," Marcus replied before tossing the radio aside. The young man whistled low. "You really know how to make friends." Marcus fixed him with a hard stare. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me who you are and why you're here." The young man raised his hands again, though his smirk returned. "Name's Ryan. I work for people who like to keep tabs on situations like this. Let's just say you've been flagged as highly interesting." Marcus's patience was wearing thin. "What kind of people?" Ryan hesitated, then shrugged. "The kind who don't want Davenport getting too comfortable. You might not believe it, but we're on the same side here." Marcus didn't trust him, but Ryan's presence raised more questions than answers. If there was a third party involved, it meant the web was even more tangled than he'd thought. And if Ryan was telling the truth, then Davenport wasn't just dealing with one threat. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen and saw an encrypted message flashing. Asterisk, asterisk. There, coming for you. Move. Asterisk, asterisk. His grip tightened on the phone. The sender was unknown, but the warning was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus read the message twice, his instincts sharpening as a low rumble filled the air. The sound of more engines, multiple vehicles, cut through the silence, growing louder with each passing second. He didn't need to see them to know that Davenport's reinforcements were closing in. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting fleeting shadows across the scene. Ryan glanced at Marcus, his face tense. "So what's the play?" "I assume you've got one of those." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He assessed the situation, noting the unconscious attackers strewn about, the limited cover, and the narrow escape routes. His mind raced through possibilities, but there was one certainty. If they stayed, they wouldn't last long. "Follow me," Marcus said curtly, motioning for Ryan to stay close. They moved quickly, weaving through alleys and cutting across deserted back streets. The sound of engines persisted, a relentless reminder that their hunters weren't far behind. Ryan struggled to keep up, his breath ragged, but Marcus's pace never wavered. Finally, they reached an abandoned industrial site on the outskirts of town. The hulking shadows of rusted machinery and empty warehouses offered some cover, but it was far from ideal. Marcus scanned the area, his eyes landing on a derelict loading dock that provided a vantage point. Up there, he said, helping Ryan climb the structure. As they crouched low, Marcus pulled a compact device from his jacket. A signal jammer. He activated it, knowing it would disrupt any tracking devices or communications within a limited radius. Ryan watched him work, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Okay, I've got to ask, who asterisk or asterisk you really? Because this isn't just some ex-military thing. This is next level. Marcus' expression didn't change. I'm the person Davenport doesn't want to meet. That's all you need to know. Before Ryan could press further, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into the site, their headlights sweeping the area. Doors opened, and a dozen men poured out, weapons drawn. At the center of the group was a man Marcus recognized immediately, Davenport himself. Tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding an air of calculated authority, Davenport was the kind of man who thrived on power and intimidation. His cold gaze swept the site as he barked orders to his men. Rain shrank back instinctively. This guy looks like he means business. He does, Marcus said quietly. Davenport stepped forward, his voice carrying over the still night. Marcus, you've been a thorn in my side for far too long. But tonight it ends. Come out, and I might consider making this quick. Marcus didn't move. He assessed Davenport's men, noting their formation and equipment. They were well trained, but they weren't invincible. Stay here, he told Ryan. Ryan grabbed his arm. Are you serious? There's no way you're taking them all on. Marcus looked at him, his expression unreadable. I've handled worse. With that, he slipped down from the loading dock, his movements silent and deliberate. He circled wide, using the shadows to his advantage, until he was behind Davenport's men. The first strike was swift and precise. Marcus took down 2 guards before they even realized he was there. Chaos erupted as the rest scrambled to respond, their shouts echoing through the site. Davenport remained calm, his confidence unshaken. He motioned for his men to fan out, knowing Marcus's skill set well enough to anticipate his tactics. But Marcus wasn't just fighting to survive. He was dismantling Davenport's operation piece by piece. He used their own strengths against them, exploiting their reliance on coordination by disrupting their lines of communication. The signal jammer ensured they couldn't call for backup, and one by one they fell. Davenport finally stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. He pulled a handgun from his coat and aimed it at Marcus, who stood in the open now, his breathing steady despite the carnage around him. You've made your point, Davenport said, his voice low and menacing, but you've also underestimated me. Before Marcus could respond, a second wave of attackers emerged from the shadows. Men Marcus hadn't accounted for. Davenport smirked, his trap sprung. But Marcus had planned for this too. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button that triggered a series of controlled explosions around the site. The blasts weren't lethal, but they created enough chaos to disorient Davenport's men. In the confusion, Marcus closed the distance between himself and Davenport. The 2 men faced off, their movements deliberate and deadly. Davenport was skilled, but Marcus was better. The fight ended with Marcus disarming Davenport and pinning him against a wall. This is over, Marcus said, his voice cold. Davenport smirked through the pain. You think you've won. You're just a pawn in a bigger game. Before Marcus could respond, a single gunshot rang out. Davenport slumped to the ground, a look of shock on his face. Marcus turned to see Ryan standing behind him, a gun trembling in his hands. Ryan's expression was unreadable. He was never going to let you walk away. Marcus stared at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. Ryan wasn't just an observer. He was part of the game too. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, Marcus realized the night wasn't over. It was only the beginning.